Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Tippie webinar series. My name is Ashley Durham, and I am the Director of Alumni Relations at Tippie, and I'll be your moderator today. This series is an initiative of the Alumni Relations Department at the Tippie College of Business. Our goal is to bring the knowledge of our faculty and staff to you wherever you may be in the world. I'm excited to have Amy Kristof-Brown, Interim Dean of the Tippie College of Business, with us today to help us take a deeper dive into working with millennials and Gen Zers in the workplace. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Your control panel should be visible on your screen. Look for the small vertical dock on the side of your screen. The top button is an orange arrow. The arrow button will expand and collapse your control panel. You can submit questions to us by clicking in the questions box within the control panel on the side of your screen. Type in your question and click send. Ask questions at any time and we'll collect these and address them during the presentation and during the Q&A. I would now like to introduce Amy Kristof-Brown, Interim Dean of the Tippie College of Business and the Henry B. Tippie Research Professor of Management. Amy earned an undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of Richmond and a PhD in organizational behavior and human resource management at the University of Maryland. Amy is passionate about the research she does, and we look forward to having her bring her knowledge and expertise to us today. Welcome, Amy, and thank you for being here.
Sorry, I think I was muted there. Thank you so much, Ashley, for the introduction and for setting this all up for us and giving us an opportunity to talk about something other than COVID for the next 50 minutes or so. I am Amy Kristof-Brown. I've been talking about this subject of millennials and now Gen Z in the workplace for several years now. And it's a topic that I think there's been a lot of sort of evolving understanding about over the last couple of years. And so my goal today is to bring you up to date on a little bit of what the research is showing us, to also answer lots of questions. If you have an opportunity, you can type questions into the question box and Ashley will sort of collect them and then she'll feed them onto me if it's something that she thinks I can respond to as I'm speaking. And in other cases, we may hold them till the end. We'll make sure that we get all the questions answered either today live during this session, or I'd be happy to follow up later during the week with some follow-up to email. So let's go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about understanding Generation NeZt, which is understanding millennials and Gen Z in your workplace. So the first thing I want to show are just a couple of visuals because I want to let them sort of speak loudly about what it is that I'm going to try to convey today, which is to sort of shift your thinking that you may have about millennials and Gen Z in particular from looking like this and having the characteristics of being entitled, disengaged, and lazy to thinking about them more like this. That it's generations of people who are connected, creative, and confident. And I want to focus on the benefits of these folks and what they're bringing into the workplace, but also to think about ways and specific action strategies that you can use to get them to be more connected and to get them to use that creativity in ways that will benefit your organization. Let's begin by kind of orienting about what particular groups we're talking about. And I want to sort of briefly speak about the different generations that we tend to talk about when we're discussing the multi-generational workforce. Over on the very left side of your screen, what you'll see is sort of our first generation who is still participating in some ways in the workforce, and that's the silent generation. They are silent not necessarily because they don't speak up, but because this was the generation that came right after what we may have heard about known as the greatest generation. And the greatest generation were those folks who were really involved in the early world wars, came back and sort of had this almost like a patriotic, very enthusiastic, almost a Camelot kind of experience, right, about them. They came back, they had saved the world, and now they were coming back into the workforce. The silent generation came a little bit after that, and they were simply not that discernible from the generation before. They were fairly quiet in terms of what they brought to the workforce, and we don't think of them as having a lot of distinguishing characteristics. What you'll see is that this is actually pretty common, that in between very sort of loud generations in terms of unique characteristics, you'll see a kind of interim generation that shares some of the characteristics of the previous and starts to take on some of the characteristics of the next generation. So that's the silence, right, who we have in the workforce right now. Then we have after that the baby boomers, and these right up until about 2016 were the most prevalent generation in the workforce in our memory. There were a lot of them simply because they were the babies that were born after the world wars, and they took the workforce by storm. They had very unique characteristics, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and there's still many of them that are left in our workforce today. Then we have Generation X. That's my generation. I'm a 1970s kid. And we were, again, somewhat quiet. There wasn't a lot of distinguishing features about Gen X. We're kind of characterized as the most I don't want to say laid back, but kind of the most nondescript of all generations. And I take somewhat of an offense to that because we had a lot of good things going for us, but we certainly didn't have the dominant characteristics that the boomers and then that next generation of millennials had. So the millennials was the next big generation that we really started talking a lot about. There wasn't a lot written and studied about Gen X. We weren't exceedingly difficult for the baby boomers. But when the millennials started to get introduced into the workforce, the baby boomers and the Gen Xers found them to be extremely challenging. And so that's part of what we're talking about today. These folks now are starting to be in sort of their mid 20s to early 40s. And Generation Z is the generation that comes next. So these are the folks right now that are still in our school system. We're starting to talk about them a lot in the university systems because they are now firmly who we are teaching in our undergraduate mix. We are pretty much done with the millennials, except for the people who are in graduate school. And it's really this Generation Z that we're seeing in our university hallways, and they are starting to now enter into the workforce in a permanent way. So these are the generations. If you look at different sources, you may see that the start and end dates on these may be slightly different. There's always a little bit of sort of vagueness about the beginning and the ending of a generation. But in general, these are the ones that we'll talk about. We're in a very unique situation right now because of the fact that we have such good longevity, particularly in the US, where we do have people in our full-time workforce that are from all 5 of these generations. And so managing that multi-generationality of those 5 different generations is exceedingly complex. And that's what I'd like to shed some light on today. So what leads to generational differences that we'll talk about? The first thing is that really people who are born during a particular period of time share a lot of the same experiences. We'll talk about what some of those really meaningful, dramatic moments are that can shape an entire generation. What happens then is that values start to come out of those shared experiences. Anytime we see a really challenging time that society is going through, or something that is really unique from prior generations, we start to hear a lot of rhetoric, we start to hear a lot of conversations about what really matters, and those things take hold and they start to form the values of the generation that's born during that time period. Then, because we have different values, and values indicate what things are important to us and the way that we think things should be done, or the things that we think are appropriate or important, they start to then lead to our behaviors and our attitudes. And that's what we see when we're in the workforce. So, when someone new comes into your workplace and they start to interact with you, you don't necessarily get to see all of their internalized values or reflect back on their shared experiences, but their attitudes and behaviors are very, very apparent. And so that's what we end up seeing is this end result. Let me give you a couple of examples here. This is a pretty busy slide, so I'm going to give you a couple of moments to really just take a read through this. But I'll talk about the general areas. I've got the generations broken up into those 5 that we talked about earlier. And the first row that you're seeing, these are really the sort of generation making events. These are the really high magnitude impact things that happened during the period that these children were born and when they were raised in mostly sort of their home environment. So, for our traditionals or our silent and our greatest generation, you've got things like the Great Depression, World War II, McCarthyism, our baby boomers born during the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, Gen Xers, we had the Challenger disaster, AIDS epidemic, divorce became a really critical issue. I was talking with someone the other day about the early movie Kramer versus Kramer. That was one of the first movies that we sort of saw that really represented divorce and the impact then on families. And so this was the generation of latchkey kids. A lot of the women at this point were going into the workforce and working. We had the collapse of the Berlin Wall. All of these things were events that shaped the people from Generation X. For our millennials, we had 9/11, clearly was one of their sort of key impactful events. The Great Recession then became in 2008, 2009, that became a really impactful event for them, both in terms of their own earnings, but also their families' financial situations. That led to, not surprisingly, this generation facing levels that were unprecedented in terms of debt. And whether that was school loans, whether it was credit card debt, whatever it might be, they had higher levels of debt than we had ever seen in prior generations. This was also the generation where really we started having the total connectivity, right? We all had the phones, starting with Blackberries and things like that, but we all had ways that we could stay connected to each other in a very, um, I would say, unwired way, right? We were no longer latched to our desktops. Finally, for Gen Z, which we're just starting to see now, this is the generation that's been raised, unfortunately, on mass shootings, again, on the use of cell phones just being so prolific that virtually everyone has them now. They're very digital in terms of what they're comfortable with. They stream their content for pretty much everything, and they expect things to be done on their own schedule, right? Everything that they have now is on demand. And now I've just added in, I said I wasn't going to talk about COVID-19, but there is no doubt that this pandemic that we're in currently is going to be a defining moment for this generation. And so what you'll see then in the following rows after that are some of the characteristics that these individuals then start to exhibit. And again, this is at a very high aggregate level. This certainly doesn't mean that every single person in that generation exhibits these characteristics, but on a whole, these are the kinds of behaviors and attitudes that we start to see both in life in general, and then in the final row at work, some of the behaviors that we start to see from these generations. So this should give you sort of a sense of how things are moving. It should start to give you a sense of why some of the clashes that we may have seen or misunderstandings that are happening at work are starting to happen. I want to go ahead and take a couple of questions because I see some of those coming in now. They're written in extremely small font, but I'm going to do my best to read them with my Gen X eyes. In light of the recent social events with George Floyd, I hear many say Gen Z is better than us and will lead us through this. We know they're diverse demographically. Do we see research as if they do see social issues differently? There is, and thank you, Megan. Megan was one of my first students at the University of Iowa. It's great to see you. We do have some research evidence that suggests that they're far more sort of open and accepting of diversity, and that has to do with racial differences. It also has to do with gender issues. So we see Gen Z being far more open and accepting and understanding of transgender individuals. It becomes something that they kind of shrug very often and say, okay, that's cool. Whatever you are, you are. And some of that is coming from the fact that there are many more multiracial individuals who are out there. We have much more acceptance of transgender. We see lots of, transgender bathrooms. We see facilities that are set up. We see demographic questionnaires that allow us to pick things that didn't necessarily fit in the pre-existing categories. And so we are seeing that that's the case. As a whole, that does not mean that there aren't subsections of the population that hold just as strongly racist or misogynist or any other type of particular value that might be held in a subcomponent of that population. So right now we see a lot of divisiveness. We see a lot of rhetoric being tossed back and forth, even across the political spectrum. And so we know that those pockets certainly exist. But as a whole, there is evidence that's suggesting that this generation is likely to be more accepting and be able to accept differences and work through them is another question that we need to get to, right? Have we equipped them with the skills and the capabilities to be able to address those problems? I think it's a great question. All right, one other one. This is by B. How would you suggest we emphasize the benefit of experience in our work, the difference between creating the campfire versus watching a video of someone doing it? I want to talk about that in a little bit because I think we are going to talk about this idea that millennials and particularly Gen Zs, who are really, really focused on watching YouTube videos about everything, that they have these ideas of what we call life hacks, right? If I can do it easier, why do I need to go through the process? And a lot of that is really good for us because if you can find a way to light a campfire that's faster and more efficient than what we tried to do in my family last weekend in an RV, it is probably a good thing, right? So there's a lot of things to be learned by watching videos, but the practice of hands-on and actually doing it is something that I think we do need to emphasize and make sure that people get the experience of doing it. Just because people have seen something in a video doesn't mean that they've really learned it. I've watched a lot of tennis. I'm a really terrible tennis player. So watching it doesn't mean that I've actually taken on the skills to be able to make it happen. So that's where I think we do need to do some bridging between learn efficient and effective ways to do things, but then also have opportunities for practice. So thank you for the questions. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and then I'm happy to take additional questions as they come in, and hopefully we can get to some specifics about how we do some of those things. There we go. All right. So what we know is even back in 2016, moving into 2017, millennials became the largest generation in our workforce. So for a while, the baby boomers heavily dominated. As we started to see them retiring, really reaching sort of high levels of retirement age, and the millennials coming into the workforce, the balance really shifted within a easily sort of 10 to 15 year time period. We know that they were the most educated generation in our workforce. That is likely not to be true in the future because Gen Z appears to be on their way to being the more highly educated generation. We continue to see people pursuing college educations more so than we have in the past. It will be interesting to see whether COVID has an impact on that. We certainly know that high levels of student debt is starting to cause lots of questions about that. And so as of now, the data is suggesting that Gen Z will be more educated than the millennials. But in comparison, certainly both of these generations have been much more sort of raised in a traditional educational system and are pursuing higher and higher degrees, but lots of different kinds of degrees, which I have to say is really interesting being someone in education right now. the traditional, I get a BBA or a BS degree, and then maybe I get an MBA later sometime in my career. There's a lot of additional options to that now with specialty master's degrees, with credentialing. There's lots of different ways to continue to add to capacity and education. In 2006 or 2017, 28% of them were at management level. I have not seen an update on those numbers, but I would assume that we're now moving closer into the high 30s and 40s. So a lot of these millennials are now just not at work, they are managing other workers. And in some case, they're managing people who are older than they are. They're managing people who are representing very different value systems than what they brought into the workplace. And we know that the millennials, because they are very achievement oriented, that a large portion of them do see themselves as moving into management very quickly. So I want to talk just very briefly about sort of some of the psychology behind the differences and sort of what we've seen happening in these generations. A lot of this research, and I'll sort of refer to some references at the end, but a lot of this comes out of some work by a researcher named Twenge. She did a lot of work comparing generations, not just sort of what do they display now, but what did the earlier generations when they also were 22, right? What did they display? And her comparative work, I think, is really fascinating because what it shows is that looking across 22-year-olds, back in the early 1900s, looking across 22-year-olds back in the 1950s, looking across 22-year-olds in the 1990s and 22-year-olds now, we see that there are some substantial differences in the things that they are valuing and the way that they're seeing themselves. One of the biggest differences that we're seeing is a much, much higher level of self-esteem in these sort of younger generations. This is a complicated issue because at the same time that they have higher levels of self-esteem, we're also seeing that they have higher levels of depression and anxiety than we've seen in some of these earlier generations. So the self-esteem is not coming without cost, but the comparative data is very, very interesting in terms of what people are reporting about how much they value themselves. And self-esteem is really the belief that you're a good person, that you have something of value to offer the world. And so what we're seeing is that the younger generations have truly been raised to believe that they are valuable. And, for parents who were raising kids back in the 1970s, this is exactly what they were trying to do, right? There was a big focus on trying to raise self-esteem in kids in school. What we've seen as a result of that is we often see in elementary schools now that there are no grades. We don't get A's, B's, C's, and D's for our kindergarteners anymore. We tend to just get feedback, right, about how they're doing. We've certainly seen a lot of definite levels of increased competitiveness also that sort of came along with this. We see a lot of the rise of traveling sports teams. My daughters were involved in competitive dance. So we go to dance competitions on weekends. They travel. We never came home without trophies. Even if they didn't do well, we never came home without trophies. So there have been a lot of things that have happened to sort of try to build and protect the self-esteem of millennials and Gen Z. And what we're starting to see are some of the effects of that. There are some really strong positives, but there's also some negatives. And one of the negative things that we're seeing is the idea of increased narcissism that comes with increased self-esteem. And narcissism is a focus on sort of self and a concern for self and wanting things the way that you want them, when you want them, exactly the way that you want them. And we know that all of the consumerism, the way that we certainly market our products now, the choices that are available through online shopping, all of those things are now geared toward people getting what they want when they want it. And so this sort of all feeds into this spiral of narcissism and self-esteem and individualization. I often use the example, my children have no idea of the concept of a show coming on at a particular time of the evening on a particular night. Like when I was a kid, I knew that Happy Days came on at 8 o'clock on Tuesday nights, and it was followed immediately by Laverne and Shirley at 8:30. Right, my whole week kind of revolved around what was happening on Tuesday nights. Now, the idea of being able to see whatever content you want whenever you want to see it is firmly ingrained in the way that they view the world. They turn on the radio, they never have to listen to what song is playing. They can simply pick what song they want to hear. And so, what we've done throughout society, not just in the educational system, but also through our marketing, through our product development, through the way that we simply shop for products, all of that has changed our world to be much more focused on the individual experience. There's a question that I've received about what key skills will Gen Z bring into the workforce. And I want to get to that in just a couple of minutes because we're going to talk specifically about the positives that they bring to us. Let's see. We've got a good question from Eric that asked about how is self-esteem defined. False self-esteem is a trophy for participation, right? It is. And when we define self-esteem, some of the earliest work on that was done by Joel Brockner. Um, the work on self-esteem is simply how do you feel about your value as a person? And so false self-esteem may mean that value that you place on yourself may be misplaced or might be based on false information. So, a trophy for participation, making you believe that you're a winner, is probably misplaced, right? The understanding of you got this trophy just because you participated is very different from you won this gold medal because you just beat the other 125 people that were in your category. And what we see is that things have evolved to generate, in many cases, false senses of self esteem. Because of the fact that we're trying to pump it up all the time by not making people feel disappointed, by not making them feel like they didn't win something. And what that has led to is probably an inflated sense of self esteem. Now, my own sort of personal uh, way that I pull together this with some of the depression and anxiety levels is that I think that kids are pretty aware um, that maybe when they get a trophy for participating, that it doesn't mean that they're the best. And I think that they're pretty aware of that. So this fine line between I report having higher self-esteem and valuing myself as a person, and yet I'm experiencing higher levels of anxiety and depression simultaneously. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have, in many ways, created situations that have made people feel like we want them to feel like they're special, but maybe they're really not. And I think that's got a lot of complexity to it that the American Psychological Association is going to be spending a lot of time trying to disentangle. So, what do employers think about millennials and Gen Z? This is going to get back to one of the questions that came earlier. This was Claren's question. So, what are the skills that they're really bringing to the workplace? Because I want to be able to understand really what they're bringing. And let me talk first about sort of some of the negative things that we think about them that were sort of showcased in that first visual that I showed. We do think very often that they have an unrealistic sense of their capabilities. And some of this may come from that trophyism that we've talked about a little bit. Um, they do seem to need a lot of reassurance that they're great. And so the fact that they're reporting higher levels of self esteem may be hiding the fact that that's a very fragile self esteem and that they need to keep being reinforced to feel it. We know that they don't seem to value traditional workplace rules. This idea of being interested in a hack, like, well, I can do that faster and easier, that kind of ignores the fact that process matters and that people care about being involved and participating in process. So it's not always about doing things as efficiently as possible, but also about making people feel like they're a part of the process. We know that they have somewhat unrealistic expectations about how quickly the workplace is going to cater to them. And how quickly they'll be able to move up in it. Again, I think that's very obviously stemming from the fact that everything else that goes on in their lives does cater to their preferences. And we know that their families are not necessarily helping in some cases. In universities, we have a lot of experience with what we call helicopter families. These are families that call in to check up on their students, even though we have a lot of legislation that prohibits us from talking to their parents about things like their grades, or what they might be doing on campus. But we have families that are wanting to be very highly involved. I have parents who have called me as an educator to say, I'd like to talk about my child's test score on that last exam that you gave. Um, and I say, I'm sorry, I'm not able to speak to you about it, but I'm happy to speak to your child about it. Please have them call me. The idea of the helicopter family stems from a lot of those values we talked about earlier, right? In the Gen X generation, the idea of moms going back to work, and with there being a really heavy emphasis on then trying to protect kids and make sure that they're safe. That has sort of carried over into parents trying to continue to make sure that their kids are safe and that they're getting all the opportunities that they think their children deserve. Probably the greatest example of this is the college admission scandals that we've seen over the last couple of years, with parents trying to do the right thing for their kids, right, by getting them into a school that they think is going to be really good for them in the future, but doing it in ways that are making very, very poor, unethical, and illegal types of decisions to try to give their kids advantages. So the helicopter families is certainly an issue. We also worry about sort of the lack of loyalty. We say, kids or millennials are willing to jump ship very quickly. We also have to be willing to acknowledge that organizations in the 1980s went through serious rounds of downsizing. And so those kids and their parents had been subjected to years of time when the employers were not showing very much loyalty to the employees either. So it goes both ways in that situation. I want to go to the next slide, and then I'll go back to some of the questions, because I want to not end here on a negative note about these folks, but to talk about some of the positives. So what do they bring to the table? What we know about these folks is that they are idealistic in a good way. That means that they don't tend to see limitations. They tend to see opportunities. They're very empowered. They think that they should have the power to do things, and they're willing to run with it. And they start out at least very enthusiastic. One of the things we need to be careful about is not squashing that, right? Being realistic about what it means to be in a workplace, but not squashing their enthusiasm. They are absolutely continuous learners. They listen to podcasts constantly. They are upgrading skills. They're ordering courses online. They're doing all kinds of things to try and add to their toolkit. I think some of this goes back to this idea of kind of leveling up. Generations that have been raised on gaming systems that have gotten to know, in order to get to the next level, you have to collect things. You have to collect things that go into your toolkit. And so they're doing this through self-directed learning and education. The opportunities that presents to us as university personnel are tremendous, and the opportunities that it presents to your businesses, I think, are also very valuable to think about. We touched on this earlier, but there is a much stronger appreciation for diversity in the population at large on the Gen Z side. And the millennial side. They are much more open-minded about differences, and they tend to be very innovative about the way they solve problems. They also reflect some of the generations' values earlier that we started to see in Gen X, and then we really firmly sort of took root in the millennials, which is this feeling of desiring a greater work-life balance. People want to be healthy. We know they're devoting tremendous amounts of their personal wealth to remaining healthy. Simultaneously, we're in a culture right now that doesn't allow us to disconnect from work very easily. So that also creates a struggle for people because they want to have a greater work-life balance, but we often do things at work that make that difficult. They're very tech savvy. They are often able to answer whatever questions you have regarding the technology and trying to get things done. They are also very responsive to feedback. And this sort of comes back to that notion of maybe the self-esteem is a little bit more fragile than we would like to see, because they are very responsive to feedback when they get it. They want to contribute, they want to feel involved and feel like they're doing meaningful things. They also do like to achieve things. They like to, because they've been given trophies for many, many things, they tend to respond positively to a lot of recognition. Which is okay. We just need to know that. And for the benefit of the planet, it is also good that they are more socially conscious. Those issues are taught in schools. We're starting to see them reflected in choices that those students are making. When my 19-year-old asked for a collapsible, reusable straw for her birthday, I thought that was great. And I went out and made sure that she got one of those. So they are certainly starting to reflect the notion that this world is fragile and they need to do things to protect it. I'm going to show this slide, and then as you take a look over it, I want to read some of the questions kind of quietly to myself so that I know what I want to address. But as you're taking a look at this graph, I want you to see this is a study that was done by Gallup, and they were looking at what different generations report that they were looking for when applying for a job. And so this is, again, another one of those studies that's been done across multiple decades, which is great because we can see some comparative data. So I want you to take a look. Hopefully everybody's screen is all right. The baby boomers are the blue dots. That's these. The Gen Xers are the green dots. And the millennials are the orange dots. We don't have enough information yet on the Gen Z to know where they're falling, but chances are pretty good they'll be quite similar to the millennials. So let me let you take a look at that for a minute and digest what this tells us. I'm going to look at some questions. All right, some of the things that I'm seeing, some questions about, are the older millennials and the younger millennials different? Absolutely. People don't fall specifically into just, hey, I'm this category and none of the other. Certainly the people who are on the edges of both generations tend to experience and demonstrate some of the characteristics of the generation before them. And then as we're moving now, the later millennials are demonstrating more of the characteristics of the Gen Zs. So we do see differences across that pool. One of the things that you'll see here in the chart, and I think this is a really interesting sort of thing to understand, is that the millennials and the baby boomers are a lot more alike than the Gen Xers. So the Gen X, the people who are now in their sort of 40s and 50s, these individuals are quite a bit different than the baby boomers in most circumstances, but the millennials are displaying a lot of the same characteristics as the baby boomers were when they were younger. And so one of the questions that I've received here, which is a good one, which is about this job hopping, right, and the sense of loyalty and what you do with millennials or Gen Zs that tend to hop jobs a lot. And there's some very, very interesting research that shows that actually millennials hop jobs less frequently than the baby boomers did at their same generation or at their same age. So one of the things that we may be seeing is that we didn't really get to see what the baby boomers did at the start of their work time. We didn't get to see what they did when they were just starting out. And now what we're seeing is a generation that's doing a lot of hopping around that the Gen Xers did not do. But it's not really all that out of the spectrum of what the baby boomers were doing earlier. It's something that we have to recognize and acknowledge. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. When people move, they take capabilities and they take skills to their new workplace that can be very helpful. But turnover is expensive. And so obviously as employers, we want to make sure that we're doing things to keep our best and brightest people in our organizations. So let me talk a little bit about one more characteristic on this graph, and then we'll go to what some of the specific activities are that you can do. one of the things I do want to point out on this is the very first row in the chart, which is this opportunity to learn and grow. The baby boomers and the Gen Xers are pretty close to each other on this one, but the millennials are just off the charts. This is something that they are very, very, very interested in. And so as employers, this is probably our greatest opportunity, because what this means for us is that these are individuals who want to learn new things. They don't want to do the same job over and over and over again. They want to advance, but not just for advancement's sake, right? They don't just want the promotion. They really do want to gather new sets of skills. This is fantastic news for people who want to have a flexible workforce, who want to do cross training and the opportunity to get people who are multi-skilled so that they can move in and out of various project teams. It really fits well with what we would call in organizational structure a flatter organization, which means less levels of hierarchy, but more movement around sort of within levels. And as millennials are coming in and wanting to learn new skills, you want to be thinking about the fact that that doesn't always have to mean a promotion upwards. It can also mean lateral skill enhancement. It can mean moving to different workplaces so that they can learn different demographic areas. It can mean moving different functions in the organization. It doesn't always have to come with a promotion. And I think that's a great opportunity for us. Okay, so what are they looking for at work? Interestingly, what they're looking for at work is a lot of the same things as the rest of us. And so these are the issues that I think bring together the generations in a way that you can be a good employer, you can be a good manager, you can be a great leader by focusing on these issues for all of your employees, not singling out, oh, millennials should get this more than other people, right? Baby boomers want meaningful work. Gen Xers want meaningful work. Millennials want meaningful work. We all want a good salary, right? There was initially some preliminary evidence that suggested that, or at least that led people to believe that millennials cared less about salary and more about flexibility. That is not true. They actually have, because of the fact that they have higher levels of debt than any of the other generations, they are very, very interested in salary, and they will often move to a new employer to get a better salary because of the fact that they have higher levels of needs than what we've seen previously. So when you're thinking about best business practices that you have in your organization, thinking about these things that are going to be good for everybody, I think is an extremely valuable way to go. Making sure that people have enjoyable coworkers, making sure that we're getting people to have a good work-life balance, being a trustworthy boss, providing meaningful work at a good salary, giving people a sense of accomplishment that doesn't have to be through promotions and raises. It can simply be through recognition and making sure that people are being told that they're doing a good job. And lots of people like that. Millennials might need it more, but everybody likes it. To just be told that what they're doing is valuable and appreciated. The other thing that I want to mention is this mentoring. They really are looking for mentoring and feedback. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind because it is something that we can do and we can do well. We just have to be very intentive and planful about that. All right, so how can we connect with them? The first one is going to rub some people the wrong way. Treat them like they're special. They do kind of expect it. And the way our society has been developing in recent years, they're not necessarily going out on a limb here. You know, we've told them that they're special. We've told them that they can have it their way. You know, we send them into Starbucks to order a coffee that has, 12 different qualifiers on the front end of it. They want to be treated as though they're an individual and they're special. But how can we do that in a way that's fair and a way that's realistic to the other people in our organization? One thing is recognizing them when they're doing well. Again, that's being sort of verbally appreciative, making sure that they're told that they're doing a good job and given feedback about what they did that was good. Giving them some autonomy, right, to make decisions, and then individualizing jobs as much as possible. That's certainly not always something that we have at our discretion, but if there is a capability of allowing people to have it their way, right, to make it theirs, to focus on aspects of the job that are really most interesting to them, that goes a long way with millennials because of the fact that they've been raised to expect that they can have things that way. Some keys to engaging them are to make sure you're considering their needs, financial, social, and psychological. You can't sacrifice one for the other. They are very engaged, they're very connected. They also have a lot of debt, and they have what I would call this fragile self-esteem. So we want to make sure that we're doing things that make sure that all of those needs are being addressed. Tell them what they're doing is important. Let them know why it's meaningful. There's a theory of intrinsic work motivation that talks all about a feeling of meaningful work and what can you do to make things more meaningful, right? Giving people a complete view of their project, making people have a lot of autonomy about how they go about completing their projects, telling them and showing them why it matters in the world. And one of the best ways to do that is connecting them with customers and letting them see how the work that they're doing makes an impact on your customers. All of those things are very, very helpful to making people understand and feel like what they're doing matters. Getting back to the issue of sort of feedback, they don't tend to like evaluation, right? They don't want to be told, oh, that wasn't very good, but they are highly responsive to what I would call coaching. And so if you frame the way that you think about interacting with millennials and Gen Zs as less of the, I'm your supervisor here to tell you whether you did a good job or not, and more as I'm a coach here to help you because both of us benefit if you get better at your job. That is something that they're much more accepting of. Having a good coach is something that even our best people need, right? We have executives with coaches. We have sports professionals that all have coaches. They have individualized coaches for lots of different needs. And so this acceptance of somebody who's a coach, who's there to help you get better, not to tell you that everything you're doing is great, but to tell you the things that you're doing that are working and the things that you're doing that could be improved upon if you made some tweaks to what you were doing. That's really valuable, and they tend to seek it and really appreciate and respond to it. I want to look at a couple of different questions here. Do they value experiences? Do they think that they can learn it all in school or a podcast? The experience side of it's a really interesting question, Megan, because what we know is that people are investing more of their personal wealth in experiences. So we know that instead of buying things, right, tangible things that they can put in their houses, we know that millennials and Gen Zs are spending more and more of their personal wealth on going out and doing things. And I think that there might be some real value in thinking about what that means in our workplaces, right? We're not asking them to buy an experience, but what they're telling us is when they have to put their money, right, into something, they are putting it into experiences and not just podcasts, right? Podcasts are free. What are they putting their money behind? They're putting it behind experiences. And so thinking about what kinds of very specific planned experiences that you can have in your workplace to let them feel like they're gaining something new. Again, they're all about wanting to do things that are advancing their skills, wanting to do things that are taking them to that next level. And so giving them experiences, giving them more work to do doesn't really seem like a great experience. But if you frame it as, here's the experience that we're crafting for you as an individual, suddenly more work becomes more palatable, right? It becomes something that they're more likely to seek and to really learn from. So I think the experience side of it is actually great. Kyle, you asked a question about that they believe they can multitask, but they don't absorb as much as they should. The research evidence would all exactly correspond with what you're saying. They are better multitaskers in the sense that they can do more things at once, right? It's very rare that you'll catch a Gen Z actually watching a movie without simultaneously being on their Snapchat at the same time that they're watching their movie and doing their homework at the same time. Right, so they're doing all of those things. Are they doing them well, and are they absorbing everything that we want them to be absorbing? The answer is absolutely not. It doesn't take a lot of absorption and a lot of thought to do Snapchat well, or maybe it does and I just don't do it very well. But those kinds of things that you don't need to meaningfully immerse yourself in, they can multitask in very, very well. The challenge becomes making sure that they understand when that is not appropriate and when there does need to be a deeper dive, when there needs to be a more focused attention. And as a supervisor, or even as a colleague, you may need to help them discern better when are the times that they do need to focus and what are the times when multitasking might be okay. So if you're in a meeting and you're trying to have a very sort of deep conversation about problem solving, and they're checking their phones and doing something else and answering their emails, that can be really frustrating because you know that their full attention is not on the problem to be solved. You need to be really careful, though, about the behavior and examples that you're setting, because often managers are sitting in those meetings with their phones, checking their phones. And so, what I would ask in that situation is to think about your own behaviors and what you do to signal to the millennials and Gen Zs when it's time to focus. There's a great book called Deep Work, which is, I'm forgetting the author at the moment, but it's a great book about carving time in your schedule for exactly what you're talking about, Kyle, which is that deep dive, unfettered attention going to one problem. And, telling people that you're reading that book, showing people on your calendars that you're doing those kinds of things can help reinforce the importance of having that focused time. I think that's really critical. I think people need to see that we're doing it because multitasking happens very, very frequently. And often it works, but many times it doesn't. We're getting kind of close to our end time here, so I want to make sure to hit some of these specific other ways to connect. A couple of these, you'll have copies of the slides, so you'll be able to go back and look at these. But really thinking about what are you doing in the culture of your organization to make people feel valued and, really a part of what's going on. Providing people information in ways that they want to digest it through social media. Thinking about ways that they can teach you and you can teach them. Thinking about relaxing that sort of 9 to 5, you have to be sitting at your work desk. Certainly after the COVID pandemic is over, we will all be much more aware of the fact that work can happen very much outside of a 9 to 5 context and outside of our work office space. So finding ways to incorporate more flexible scheduling is going to be very helpful for connecting with these individuals and getting them involved in opportunities that they really care about, things that they want to do and they want to pursue. That can be a great way to keep them and get them involved. I want to just quickly speak before we finish up here about COVID, because there's some pretty good research that's been done on what defines a generational moment. And a generational moment is that time period where this is going to be a defining moment for these kids that are being raised now. And COVID-19 is certainly going to be one of those. It meets both of these characteristics that define what a generational moment will be. So I think it's a very interesting question for us to start asking ourselves, what are the lessons, right? What are the ways that these different generations are responding? And there's some preliminary evidence that's out there right now that I think is sort of interesting to take a look at. It's just coming out. What we do know is that the Gen Zs were extremely hard hit by this. They had very sort of precarious jobs. We had a lot of them working in the gig economy. A lot of millennials were doing that as well. Those jobs simply disappeared. And so this is going to take a long time for them to bounce back. Interestingly, the financial implications of this for the millennials are actually probably worse, simply because they don't have as much time to kind of regroup as the Gen Zs actually do. Gen Z also is still pretty connected to their family units in many cases, so they have a bigger safety net. So the millennials are going to be particularly squeezed by this. We know that they're moving their money around, they're spending money on essential items, but they're not yet saving. And this is going to be a big concern as we move forward. Interestingly, Gen Z report being less concerned about COVID in general, but they're actually better than millennials are at doing the kinds of things that we know are actually behaviors that can reduce the spread of the virus. So there's some interesting preliminary data coming out on them. There's no question that this is going to be a defining moment for them. And thinking about, what are the lessons that they're going to learn out of this? What are the values that we want them to take away? Um, the ideas that we can work anywhere, we can work flexibly, and that we all are in this together and need to kind of focus on helping each other and supporting each other. I hope those are lessons that come out of this. I think those would be good things for this generation. We have a multi-generational workforce. We're trying to respect each other. We're trying to learn from each other. There's tremendous opportunities to do that. And there are great things that we can do when we work together. Learning new ways to do them, though, is difficult. And being respectful and open to those opportunities to learn from each other, I think, can be very valuable. I'm happy to continue to answer some questions now. You can also email me later, and I can follow up with some answers to questions. I know Ashley will send out the slides from the presentation today. I'm keeping my eye. I've got like 2 minutes left in my talk here, but let me try to get to a couple of those questions. These are resources that I'll just quickly flash onto the screen, but those are ones that I pulled a lot of information from for the talk today. There's also a great book that's being written by one of our PhD students who graduated from here. Her name is Dr. Megan Gerhardt. She's at Miami of Ohio University, and she's writing a book that I have been promised one of the first copies of that is about sort of the millennials and Gen Zs. And she's done tremendous work in this area. So I would recommend that you look for that as it comes out. So questions that I can take now. Let me go down a little bit more. Talked about those. John, you're talking about some of the differences between millennials and Gen Zs. I think you might be getting some gender differences in there as well, not just generational differences, but big differences between kids that have different experiences. We also know that siblings tend to arrange themselves in opposition to the other. So if one of them frames themselves as the smart one, the other one tends to frame themselves as, the athletic one or the strong one. And, as parents and also as supervisors, I think it's really important that we continue to tell them you're not just one category, right? You've got great things that you can pull from a lot of different areas and different things that you bring to the table. How do you balance positive and negative reinforcement with millennials? Positive reinforcement is generally perceived most favorably. By negative reinforcement, I'm assuming that you probably mean like some sort of reprimand. And I think you couch it all as feedback. And so when you're talking about millennials, they are going to be most responsive to feedback if you frame it as an opportunity for something that they could do better next time. This is a way, that you could get to the next promotion. This is a way that I could really see you enhancing your future with this company if you're able to work on these areas that need continued improvement. Telling them what they do well, they're expecting that. They want to hear it. They want to get a lot of that. But giving them specific ways that they can improve is actually generally pretty positively received. So think again about that coaching mentality and what you're doing to try to help them get better and to help them accomplish the goals that they're setting for themselves. Is treating them like they're special any different from how others would like to be treated? That's a great question, Lindsay. Everybody likes to be thought that they're special. Everybody likes to be told that they're special. This is absolutely the consistent theme that is at the underlying core of good leaders, good managers. They value their people and they let them know that. And so you're exactly right that their wanting it is no different than others. They may expect it a little bit more than others do, but all of us benefit from hearing that we're valued and that we're important. Let's see, a couple of final questions about seems like it's better in the long run to address the weak, unhealthy self-esteem rather than work around it. David, I wish I knew how. That is a really tough one. Making sure that you're not just giving people false praise for no reason. Letting your kids know that they're not always going to be the winner, but that you still value them and respect them anyway. All of those are things we can do as parents to try and tackle this because it's a big concern. It really is. I like the advice that I've seen often, which is as parents for kids, and I think it's the same for supervisors and new employees in the workforce. The idea is you're not trying to make the way in front of them smooth so that they have no problems. Your goal is to try to equip them with the capabilities that they need to face whatever problems come their way. And that's a critical mindset shift, I think, for parents and for supervisors. So equipping them with skills, equipping them with what they need to face whatever challenges come their way is something that we can all do at work. So thank you. All right, I think we've reached our time spot. I think I've got 1 o'clock, a little bit after. So thank you all for joining us today. If you have additional questions, I'd be happy to respond to them. You can send them to my email directly. You can also connect with Ashley and the Alumni Association and let them know sort of what you'd like to see in addition to this. Thank you for taking the time today. I know you're sitting on a lot of Zoom calls and conversations, so I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. Thanks so much. Bye now.
Yes, and thank you, Amy, for being our presenter and for all the amazing information you've shared with everyone today. As Amy said, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to her via her email, which is on the screen. When the webinar ends in just a moment, you'll see a quick survey. We'd be grateful if you could share your thoughts and help us make future webinars even better and around topics that are of interest to you. Watch for a follow-up email with today's recording of the webinar and feel free to forward and share that with others. Additionally, you can find all our Tippie webinars on our college YouTube channel. On behalf of the Alumni Relations Department at the Tippie College of Business, thank you so much again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.